Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, A Revolution in Type, Gender, and the Making of the American Press with Ayelet Brinn. Before we get started, a reminder that your video and your audio will be off throughout the program. You can send us your questions via the question panel at the bottom right of your screen. We ask that you keep questions short and please refrain from comments so that we can try to get to all of the questions this evening. I'm delighted to introduce Ayelet Brinn. Ayelet is an assistant professor of Judaic studies and history at the University of Hartford, where she holds the Philip D. Feltman Professorship in Modern Jewish History. Her first book, A Revolution in Type, Gender and the Making of the American Yiddish Press, was just released with New York University Press. Welcome, Ayelet.
Thank you so much.
Such fun to have met you yesterday when you toured at the center to see Yiddish Global Culture, and now to see you virtually. And so looking forward to the program. So over to you.
Great. So I want to start by thanking all of you for coming tonight. I also want to thank Lisa, as well as everyone else at the Yiddish Book Center, not just for having me tonight, which I'm very grateful for, but also for everything that they do. I researched and wrote much of this book at the height of the pandemic, and I have to say that it honestly would not have been possible to continue working on this project without the amazing digitization projects that institutions like the Yiddish Book Center have done, which allowed me to continue to have access to invaluable primary sources, even while libraries and archives remain closed. So I'll start by sharing my screen, and then I'll get started. Okay, great. So I'll be speaking for about 40 minutes or so, maybe a little less, and then I'll be opening up to questions and comments. So to start off my talk, I wanted to give you a sense of how I came to this topic and the questions that animate it. So I came to history through my passion for archives. So part of my process of deciding on a research topic during my first year of graduate school was exploring the finding aids of various collections at local libraries and archives, which I hoped would give me a sense of how the resources available to me might shape my development as a scholar, and the questions I'd be asking about Jewish and American history and culture going forward. So when I started looking through finding aids at the University of Pennsylvania's library, I noticed that they had the archives of B.Z. Goldberg, who was a prominent New York-based Yiddish journalist and a son-in-law of Shalom Aleichem. The collection description included a brief biography of Goldberg that especially piqued my interest. So about halfway through, it described how Goldberg got his start in Yiddish journalism. Wishing to write for the Yiddish newspaper The Day, but being told by the editor that he didn't have the popular stuff the newspaper needed, BZG wrote under his secretary's name a popular feature under the title A Diary of a Young Woman. Ed Lynn, the editor, didn't believe it was the secretary, but published the articles anyway. They were an instantaneous success and ran for a number of months. When the identity of the real author was revealed, Goldberg became a correspondent of The Day and a permanent member of the staff. So immediately I was struck by this narrative, how it suggested that only by masquerading as a woman could Goldberg gain a foothold into the Yiddish press. I also found the repetition of the word popular particularly interesting, which suggested to me that it was not only the content that Goldberg submitted that the editor viewed as popular, but also that there was some sense that writing by women, or in this case, a man pretending to be a woman, was seen as more popular in and of itself in Yiddish journalism at this time, which would have been in the early 1920s. So as I'll return to later on in my talk when I discuss Goldberg in a bit more detail, there are actually several factual inaccuracies or pieces of misleading information in this paragraph. This biographical note was adapted from an essay by Goldberg himself, and like many figures associated with the Yiddish press, he wasn't always a reliable narrator about his life. But this narrative immediately sparked questions for me. So what led Goldberg to conflate the editor's desire for popular writing with writing by, for, or about women? And was this part of a broader pattern within the Yiddish press, or just a strange, interesting case study? So I started digging into firsthand accounts of the Yiddish press in America in this period, and it turns out that rumors were rampant that many young men were deciding, just like Goldberg, to submit manuscripts of various kinds to American Yiddish newspapers under female names. Unlike other contexts that I was familiar with before this research, where men had to where women had to pose as men to get published, rumors abounded that in the context of the Yiddish press, it was instead advantageous for men to pose as women. So one example that I have here is from journalist Yosef Chaikin, who described this as a common phenomenon, not just in articles, but also in poetry submitted to one newspaper, the Freie Arbeiterstimme, which was the anarchist newspaper. So according to him, countless anecdotes have circulated among writers about their experiences with Janowski, who was the editor of the newspaper. Dozens of poets published poems under women's names, which under their own names had been rejected. So in Chaikin's assessment, this reflected editors' general desire to feature women, but also the different standards used for poetry by men and by women, noting that a few weeks later, if Janowski received the same poems signed with a female name, he would not only receive them as eagerly as a precious gem, but also reprimand other writers by saying, "You should learn to write poetry from her." So Chaikin's statement about countless men employing this strategy is an exaggeration, but there are several traceable cases of men writing under female pseudonyms in the Yiddish press. In addition, this phenomenon was not actually limited to the late 1910s and early 1920s, but instead occurred throughout the history of the press. But what men decided to write under female pseudonyms and how they described their decisions to do so changed significantly over time in ways that trace the development of the Yiddish press and its changing relationship to American culture and to transnational Jewish culture. So this small description sparked my interest in exploring a broader research project, which investigated the relationship of the Yiddish press to gender in all of its complexities, encompassing women writers, attempts by authors to reach female readers, and the ways that questions of gender lay really at the very heart of American Yiddish journalism. So as many of you likely know, at the turn of the 20th century, Yiddish newspapers were incredibly influential political and cultural institutions. They set the tone for American Jewish life in a variety of ways and served invaluable roles for their hundreds of thousands of readers. By the 1920s, if you were a Yiddish-speaking farmer, housewife, theater-goer, humor lover, you could find a periodical that was supposed to cater specifically to your needs. But there were also newspapers, especially daily newspapers, that hoped to attract a broader audience. Each of them had a specific ideological agenda: Orthodox Judaism, socialism, communism. But the most successful ones attempted to court a mass audience, including those outside of their ideological window. The rationale was that if a paper could reach a broad public, they could trounce rivals in the battle for circulation figures, advertising dollars, and ideological influence. So it's important to keep in mind that this transformation of Yiddish newspapers into successful and essential institutions was not really inevitable in any way. So there was no real precedent for Yiddish newspapers on this scale in Eastern Europe. There were a handful of European Yiddish weeklies and monthlies before the 1880s, but most of them attracted relatively small reading audiences. And because there were harsh censorship laws restricting Yiddish publishing in the Russian Empire, the first daily Yiddish newspaper in Europe did not appear until about 20 years after the founding of the first Yiddish daily in the United States. So the mass consumption Yiddish press, especially the daily press, blossomed as an American phenomenon before it took hold in Europe. And because of this, many Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants, especially those who would have come over before about 1900, would have never read a newspaper before coming to the United States. But quickly on their arrival, many began to see newspapers as basically indispensable parts of their daily lives. Newspapers became a mix of trusted friends, advisors, tour guides, entertainers, and social welfare agencies. By the 1920s, not only was there a large and broad market of options, but the Yiddish press had become by far the most successful foreign language newspaper market in the US. The circulation of the most popular daily, the Forward or Vorwärts, surpassed 200,000 issues at its peak and at times even exceeded that of the New York Times. So in my book, A Revolution in Type, I argue that questions of women and gender are crucial to understanding how and why the Yiddish press became such a powerful and sort of multivalent force. I make this case through close readings of the most influential newspapers that span the ideological range of the Yiddish press, from the socialist Vorwärts to the Orthodox conservative Morgen Journal, also called the Jewish Morning Journal. These newspapers espoused very different ideologies, even though all of them were produced within several blocks of each other in an area of New York's Lower East Side called Yiddish Newspaper Row. But reading through these newspapers in tandem allowed me to see just how much they influenced each other and how often writers actually went back and forth between these different publications. Sometimes these writers changed their messages in order to better fit the ideological line of their writing venue. But in other cases, writers' arguments were actually remarkably consistent across publications, even when this undermined or contradicted the overall ideological project of their publishing venue. So this also allowed me to see that women's content was present from almost the very start of the Yiddish daily press, but became more complex and salient over time. In this period, editors introduced a variety of content that they asserted was meant to appeal to female readers. This included advice columns, serialized fiction, advertising, women's columns, and eventually women's pages. In reality, these features were, of course, popular with men as well as women, and women's reading habits were never confined to the parts of the paper marked for women. But editors highlighted their intention to attract female readers using this content. And at each stage of the development of the Yiddish press, debates about women and about gender also became prisms through which editors and publishers explored the roles they wanted their papers to play in readers' lives. In fact, newspaper producers espousing very different ideologies all invoked the needs and interests of female readers to represent their desire to build and speak to a mass reading audience. So Abraham Kahan, who was the longtime editor of The Forward, boasted that when he took control of the paper, he turned it into a publication that, quote, the masses of the Jewish people and even women could read, end quote. Yechezkel Saracen, who was an editor of the Jewish Daily News, or publisher of the Jewish Daily News, described his desire to turn his newspaper into a product that women would want to pick up at the market along with other household goods. And conversely, once he had established himself as a Yiddish journalist, B.Z. Goldberg asserted that any time a paper published something addressing women, they were really trying to reach the masses, the folk, the people. So these discussions reflected long-standing traditions in Yiddish culture that equated the reading needs of female audiences and mass audiences. So for Jews in early modern Eastern Europe, Yiddish was the language of everyday life as opposed to the more scholarly or religious Hebrew. Women generally had limited access to religious knowledge and were not taught to read Hebrew. Therefore, anything written in Yiddish was seen as having an implied female or mass uneducated audience. Because Hebrew literacy and religious knowledge were crucial to masculine identity, those who read in Yiddish were often referred to as women and men who are like women. And in this context, some men decided to write their Yiddish writing under female pseudonyms to separate it from their more masculine Hebrew output or output in other European languages. So therefore, the Yiddish press's relationship to gender and mass culture was building on previous traditions within Jewish culture. But at the same time, these discussions within the Yiddish press equally drew on newer trends that were taking shape in American journalism at this time that equated female readers with turning newspapers into mass consumption publications. So in this period, American newspapers transformed from being funded mainly by political parties to being funded by advertising and subscriptions. This meant that newspapers had to attract a broader pool of both readers and advertisers. And many advertisers assumed that women were the ones buying household products. So this was the period where mainstream newspapers began to include women's columns, women's pages, and advice columns for the first time, which were all meant to demonstrate to advertisers that women read their periodicals. So in determining how to cultivate a mass audience for their own publications, the producers of the American Yiddish newspapers looked to these innovations in the American popular press as a model. So they harnessed the blueprint of the American popular press at exactly the time when attracting a female audience lay at the heart of what it meant to be a mass consumption newspaper in the United States. And because of this, appealing to women readers became deeply intertwined with Yiddish newspapers' attempts to market themselves as thoroughly American cultural endeavors. So this gives a sense of how throughout its history, gender became the prism through which the Yiddish press and those associated with it continually reshaped the boundaries between traditional and modern, political and commercial, and between American and transnational Jewish cultural trends. This made women's columns and women's pages spaces within Yiddish newspapers that were particularly dynamic and rich. but it also made them rife with contradictions because the various political, cultural, and commercial priorities of these newspapers were not always neatly aligned. So only through a gendered history can we understand the full power and full complexity of the history of the American Yiddish press. So in my book, I explore various facets of the Yiddish press's changing relationship to women and gender. This includes discussions of the changing content in these papers, exploration of the work that women did behind the scenes as translators, secretaries, and writers, and also the experience of readers who read these publications. And I'm happy to expand on any of those aspects during the Q&A. But for the rest of my talk tonight, I want to turn back to the idea of men writing under female pseudonyms and offer 3 case studies. The first 2 are men who chose to write under female pseudonyms at 2 very different stages in the history of the press. And the third is a female writer whose writing was deemed so good that rumors consistently surrounded her that her byline must be a cover for a male author. So together, the lives and careers of these figures reveal the crucial but inconsistent and complex role of gender in the development of the American Yiddish press. So my first case study is Getzel Zelikovic, who wrote the first Yiddish women's column using the name The Lithuanian Wise Woman. Zelikovic had a really fascinating life and had one of the more varied backgrounds in Yiddish journalism. He was born in 1863 in what is now Lithuania. After receiving a traditional religious education, he moved to Paris to study Egyptology and then served as a translator on British expeditions to Egypt. He then moved to America in the 1880s. He was briefly a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He was then resigned or forced out under somewhat mysterious circumstances. And then he moved to New York and shifted to a full-time career in journalism. He had done a little bit of journalism before, but this became his full-time career at that point. So in 1890, he joined the staff of the Orthodox, politically conservative Tageblatt, also called the Jewish Daily News. This paper had been founded 5 years earlier and was the first Yiddish daily to survive more than a few issues anywhere in the world. Zelikovic joined its staff at a time when its publisher was trying to transform it into a more successful commercial venture by expanding advertisers, buying up rival publications, and transforming the paper's content to more closely resemble the sensational style of the most successful American newspapers. So both Zelikovic and his publisher saw his women's columns as integral to this process of transformation. So he began writing these columns in 1891, and he continued to employ this Lithuanian wise woman persona on and off for the next 2 decades or so. And in its earliest days, the column carried the dual title of Ezras Nashim and Ladies' Corner, which is Ladies' Corner, translated and transliterated into Yiddish. And this title was a play on words. Ladies' Corner was a very common title for women's columns in the English language press. But Ezras Nashim was also the phrase used to refer to the women's section of an Orthodox synagogue. So read in different ways, this title signaled the paper's commitments to both tradition and adaptation, depending on how you looked at it. Within these columns, Zelikovic offered readers a fusion between ideologically driven content and entertainment-driven content. In some ways, these goals diverged because the column's tongue-in-cheek style sometimes undermined its sincerity. But in other ways, by repackaging guidance in really entertaining wrappings, Zelikovic ensured that readers would absorb his arguments more fully. So the most overt function of these columns was to convey the paper's views on women's roles in society. Zelikovic often highlighted women's supposedly innate attraction to housework and motherhood. He also expressed qualified support for women's rights, as basically all Yiddish newspapers did. Writing for a religious publication, his columns particularly highlighted the role that mothers could play in ensuring the next generation grew up religiously observant. He purported to speak from the position of a woman and mother of children, and he used this female persona to model a vision of proper Jewish womanhood for his readers. So one fun example is that he explained that the week's column was appearing a day earlier than it usually appeared because, quote, like all women, the Lithuanian wise woman would be too busy preparing her house for the upcoming holiday of Passover to write her column on its usual day. So throughout his time writing as the Lithuanian wise woman, Zelikovic set up a pretty complex relationship between his columns and the rest of the newspaper. In some ways, he suggested that these columns were a sort of separate sphere, a female oasis within a male-centric publication. But at other times, he described an avid male readership for these columns, saying that it was popular with male and female readers alike. And over time, Zelikovic tried to emphasize the connections between his women's columns and the rest of the paper. And he did this by fostering a sort of dialogue between the Lithuanian wise woman and other personas. So in 1908, for example, he wrote an article under his own name where he responded to the Lithuanian wise woman's most recent column, which praised British suffragettes. In it, he criticized the Lithuanian wise woman for praising non-Jewish women instead of acknowledging historical Jewish champions for women's rights. So in this column, he argued that the biblical prophet Deborah was actually, in some ways, the first fighter for female suffrage, and that there was also this rich history of Jewish feminists long before the contemporary suffrage movement. So this column reflected a common rhetorical strategy in the Jewish daily news, arguing that political or cultural innovations in the US had historical Jewish precedents. For example, many articles argued that Judaism was innately the most feminist religion, and therefore that supporting women's rights was in no way inconsistent with Orthodox Jewish practice. So to be sure, in making these arguments, the paper staff carefully selected certain aspects of the Jewish past and present, while omitting or reshaping others. But for the paper's staff, these arguments serve to make Judaism and Jewish history compatible with contemporary social trends. And they use this in order to offer models to readers about how to acclimate to surrounding trends while still remaining deeply tied to Jewish culture and religious practice. By writing these articles under two names, Zelikovic found ways to express support for women's rights and religious continuity, while also providing audiences with engaging reading material. In addition, he created this sense that there was a lively newspaper staff that was all in dialogue with one another, and reinforced the idea that reading this newspaper was an interactive process where articles spoke to one another and to concerns related to readers' lives. So Zelikovic's women's columns were one of the longest running series to appear in any Yiddish newspaper. But in many ways, the introduction of these columns in the early 1890s reflected a broader trend happening in the Yiddish press. And he was not the only editor of a Yiddish paper to try his hand at writing women's columns during that decade. So another example is that in 1898, Michal Zemetkin, who was an early editor of the Socialist Forward, also introduced a women's column, which he wrote under the pen name Sophia Housewife. In it, he explored women's issues from an overtly radical perspective. So though Zemetkin and Zelikovic's women's columns espoused very different politics, together they demonstrate how Yiddish newspapers across the board began directly appealing to female readers in the 1890s. They also reflect that the majority of women's columns in this early period of the Yiddish press were written by men. This began to change only after 1914, when all of the major American Yiddish dailies began publishing full-page or half-page women's sections for the first time. Again, in introducing women's pages, the American Yiddish Press outpaced the European Yiddish Press, where dailies only introduced women's pages starting about 10 to 20 years after American ones. Much of the content of these pages was still written by men, but these pages opened up some more room than before for some women to gain footholds into Yiddish journalism. There were a few women who had careers before, but still very limited numbers. Even though the number of women remained quite small, editors began emphasizing their supposed support of female writers. Usually this was more of a marketing strategy than an accurate assertion. For some editors, including articles by women, became a way to signal their paper's more progressive approach to journalism. For others, it was an attempt to boost their circulation as they viewed writing for or by women as more popular. In either case, it became a way for editors to signal that the Yiddish press had reached a new, more modern stage in its development. So this helps provide context for my second case study, which is B.Z. Goldberg. In earlier periods of the history of the Yiddish press, men writing under female pseudonyms within the Yiddish press were often the editors of these publications. In contrast, beginning in around the 1910s, rumors began to circulate that young men like B.Z. Goldberg were submitting work under female pseudonyms without editors' knowledge. In the case of Goldberg, he was studying towards a graduate degree in psychology at Columbia when he decided to transition to writing for Yiddish newspapers. And according to Goldberg, submitting articles under a female name greatly eased this transition. So I want to return now to the biographical statement about Goldberg I showed you at the beginning of this talk. This isn't the only source where Goldberg recounted his origin story. Each time he changed the details slightly. For example, this is the only source I found where he identified his pseudonym as his secretary's name. In others that I found later in my research, he instead provided the actual pseudonym, Ida Brenner. And this was tremendously helpful because A Diary of a Young Woman was not actually the name of the series of column that marked his debut as Ida Brenner. Instead, it was a series titled The Truth About Married Life. And he only debuted the second series several months later called Letter to a Young Woman. Reading these two series together shows how writing as a woman allowed Goldberg to experiment with various personas and styles of journalism, something that would later become a hallmark of his work under his own name. So in Letter from a Young Woman, the narrator is a young, naive woman experiencing love for the first time and writing in a very melodramatic, emotional style. In contrast, The Truth About Married Life offered readers expert, psychologically driven advice on issues related to everything that couples might face, from gambling to infertility. And in these articles, Goldberg usually used love as an avenue to teach readers about the latest theories on social psychology and sexuality that he had studied as a student at Columbia. In a later offshoot of this series, Goldberg even identified Ida Brenner as having a PhD in psychology, a degree that Goldberg had pursued but failed to achieve before switching to a career in journalism. So in these articles, Goldberg attempted to translate these psychological theories so that they were relevant to Yiddish newspaper readers. So he promoted what he viewed as a specifically Ashkenazi Jewish vision of modern companionate marriage. For example, Ida Brenner contrasted the domestic boredom that she felt was common in middle-class or aspiring middle-class American Jewish households with an idealized understanding of the Jewish past in Eastern Europe, where, quote, the wife was an equal partner in running the business and couples had something in common. Besides a wife, she was a partner, a bookkeeper, a secretary. So here Goldberg referred to a relatively common pattern for East European Jews. As male religious education was prized above everything else, women were expected to be full partners in business to allow their husbands time to study. By replacing marital business partnerships with separate spheres, Goldberg argued, American Jews had damaged the foundations of their marriages. In reality, in Eastern Europe, these dynamics did not always lead to happy companionate marriages. But for Goldberg, what was important about this model was that it provided a language for him to explain modern psychological understandings of marriage to his readers in ways that he hoped would resonate. So in some sources, Goldberg played down the diversity of his writing as Brenner, describing all of these articles as light or juicy or popular. But in others, Goldberg played up the connection between his desire to blur gender boundaries and his desire to cross cultural boundaries by infusing his columns with what he had learned at Columbia. So Goldberg was part of a younger cohort of Yiddish writers who had either been born in America or had immigrated at a young age. After earning advanced degrees at American colleges, most of them spent some time completely cut off from Yiddish culture or engaging equally with American culture in English and Yiddish. And when they had returned to the Yiddish cultural sphere, they tried to find ways to infuse these broader academic or cultural conversations into the Yiddish press. And many of them argued that writing under a female pseudonym allowed them to do so. So this dynamic unearths the full complexity of women's columns and women's pages in the Yiddish press in the 1910s and 1920s. While editors wanted to ensure that papers included women's content, they did not always pay particularly close attention to what women or men who wrote as women conveyed in their columns. The same dynamic was actually common in the American popular press at this time as well. As a result, to borrow the language of historian Alice Voss, editorial inattention allowed those who wrote for women's pages a limited freedom. They often flew beneath the radar, precisely because in editorial terms, it was the least important section of the newspaper. So this meant that women's pages became a space where men writing under female pseudonyms could experiment a bit more freely with how to translate broader cultural discourses into the Yiddish press. So the phenomenon of men writing under female pseudonyms shows that the gender politics of the press in this period created certain limitations and certain opportunities for male and female writers. But as I explore in my book, the stakes of this moment played out very differently for women and for male writers who pretended to be women. So while sources by male writers and editors describe the supposed openness of the early interwar Yiddish press to female voices, sources that privilege the experiences of female writers offer a very different assessment of this period in the history of the Yiddish press. So in letters, memoirs, fictionalized accounts, and sometimes even within their columns, women writers suggested that editors offered far less support in practice than these public statements suggested. So again, while the advent of women's pages opened up more opportunities for writers who were women to contribute to the Yiddish press, many women still felt really constrained by the limits that editors imposed on women writers and readers alike. When they did submit work to Yiddish newspapers, women faced harsh gendered critiques of their writing. And behind the scenes, women performed a variety of roles in the production of Yiddish newspapers that editors rarely acknowledged publicly, serving as secretaries, translators, and writers of anonymous content, which suggests that editors' support of women's careers was conditional at best. So together, the experiences of female writers and men writing under female pseudonyms bring to bear a pretty striking contradiction. While women's voices were seen as particularly marketable in this period, women writers often encountered so many obstacles when trying to forge careers working for these publications. So one interesting and pretty poignant example of this phenomenon is the life and career of Rosa Lebensboim. Lebensboim achieved her most long-lasting legacy as the author of poems, which she signed under the pseudonym Anna Margolin. However, for the majority of her life, she made her living by contributing women's columns and translations to Yiddish newspapers, as well as editing the women's page of the Yiddish daily The Day, Der Tag, for several years. So from the very beginning of her career, Lebensboim faced constant accusations that her writing in various genres was so good that it must have actually been written by a man. So in 1909, for instance, she submitted her first short stories to the Freie Arbeiterstimme under the name Chava Gross. According to Lebensboim's longtime partner, Ruben Iceland, the editor was so taken with these stories that he invited their author to meet with him. This invitation was in part an attempt to encourage further submissions, but he was also very suspicious that Chava Gross was actually a man masquerading as a woman because he had already had many experiences of male beginners who sent him things under women's names. And similar rumors surrounded Lebensboim a decade later when she made her debut as a poet writing under the pseudonym Anna Margolin. So in letters from this time, Lebensboim and Ruben Iceland recounted overhearing conversations in local cafes where the patrons were arguing about who the pseudonym Anna Margolin might be a cover for. While the theories varied, most seemed to agree that the poems had to be written by a man. So in one exchange that I find particularly telling, Iceland linked these conversations to the perceived quality of the poems and the ways they did not necessarily fit with assumptions at this time about the quality of writing that women were able to produce. So, quote, why people want AM to be a man is beyond me. The general opinion, however, is that these poems were written by an experienced hand and a woman can't write like that. So throughout her career, Lebensboim often voiced her disdain for Yiddish journalism, and especially the roles that women like her were allowed to perform in its production and its reception. As was the case for most female writers associated with these dailies, most of the articles published under her own name appeared on the women's page of this newspaper. While many Yiddish literary figures read these women's columns by Lebensboim with keen interest, she was never a big fan of her own journalistic work. In fact, according to Ruben Iceland, she used to become enraged when someone praised her articles because she viewed this work as a means to make a living rather than an actual worthy literary pursuit in and of itself. So this perspective was not necessarily unique to Lebensboim, nor even to writers of women's interest material. Many Yiddish poets and novelists made their living writing articles for the press and felt equally dismissive of their journalistic output. But Lebensboim seems to have felt particularly constrained in her role as a women's columnist. And at times, her critiques of the press seeped into her journalism. So in 1915, she devoted one of her columns to criticizing gender imbalances that she saw as endemic in English language newspapers. So I'm going to quote this article for a second. A strange thing about the local press is that it seems to be open to women and they occupy an important niche. But in reality, women are able to write frankly and freely about two things: clothing and love. Moreover, there are no women in American papers who are city editors, managers, or editorial writers. In Lebensboim's view, editors also limited the style that writers can employ in women's columns, as they must be written in a banal way because originality is the quickest way to the wastebasket. So in this particular column, she doesn't explicitly address gender dynamics within the Yiddish press, but it's likely that she's trying to indirectly highlight similar problems within her own publishing sphere. But at other times in her articles, her critiques of contemporary newspaper culture hit even closer to home. So in that same year, she devoted an installment of her column to disparaging then-President Woodrow Wilson's decade-old book, A History of the American People, and its male-centric approach to history. So she said, if a resident of the planet Mars should read this book, he would surely think that on Earth women, God forbid, do not exist. She argued that Wilson's chronicle represented a broader pattern, as most history books written by men relegate women to serving as the silent partners of progress. As an antidote, she suggested reading work by female writers who offered a counterweight to histories written by and dominated by men. Lebensboim's critique of Wilson's work would likely have piqued the interest of her readers because this exact book that she's critiquing was at that very moment being serialized in translation in this newspaper. So by arguing that excluding women from history writ large provided a skewed sense of the historical past, she suggested, somewhat slyly, gender imbalances that existed within the newspaper in which her articles appeared. So when Lebensboim accused the American popular press and American writers of making it seem as if newspapers welcomed female journalists, when in reality constraining how and what women wrote, she therefore may well have been describing not only her own career, but the careers of other female journalists working for the Yiddish press as well. But the careers of women in Yiddish journalism also reflect a much more complex dynamic. So on the pages of these newspapers, it seems as if women only authored one form of content because this was the material that they published under their own names. But in reality, over the course of their careers, many women contributed to the press in a variety of ways, by working behind the scenes, by writing for multiple publications, and by writing anonymously or under pseudonyms in ways that stretched beyond the boundaries of women's writing. So one example we have of this is this payroll for the day that shows Lebensboim as translating material in a given week, and none of the material in that week contains an attribution to her as a translator. Her name is also spelled in multiple different ways on different payrolls, and sometimes she's listed under her married name. So this gives a sense of exactly how difficult it is to fully trace the experiences of women who worked for the Yiddish press. So in retrospective accounts, male editors touted their newspapers as particularly hospitable places for female journalists, but they were doing so in ways that also ensured, either wittingly or not, that the full extent of work performed by women remained largely invisible. So despite the exceptional nature of Rosa Lebensboim's life and therefore her archival trail, they're just amazing materials related to her work life, the careers of women like Lebensboim reflect a broader pattern of tension between the emancipatory experiences that careers as writers or journalists gave to women, and the ways that male editors, colleagues, or partners hindered the development, limited the prospects, and concealed the contributions that women made to the Yiddish press. So to conclude quickly, I have primarily focused on the lives and careers of several authors who exemplify the different ways in which a focus on gender illuminates the history of the American Yiddish press. So Zelikovich's columns typify how editors of the first Yiddish dailies used women's columns to experiment with how to translate ideological messages to a mass audience and how to transform Yiddish newspapers into mass consumption products. 30 years later, Goldberg's columns reveal how diverse the content of the Yiddish press had become and how writing as a woman allowed certain young men a gateway into the Yiddish press. At the same time, the career and writing of journalists like Rosa Lebensboim revealed the distance between the ways in which women readers and writers figured into the rhetorical tropes surrounding the Yiddish press and the much more complicated lived reality of these women's lives. So in my book, these are only 3 of many individuals whose lives and work illustrate the importance of gender to the development of the Yiddish press. And I'm happy to elaborate on anything I explored today or any other aspect of my research, but I feel like this is a good place to stop and open up for comments and questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Fascinating, and reason why we all were eagerly awaiting publication of this book. Fantastic presentation. So let's jump in. This picks up on what you were just talking about. Could the hiring of female columnists also have been an economic strategy in the Yiddish newspapers? I am a media historian, and I've found that many mainstream publications like to create a perception of being modern or even egalitarian, but in reality, they could pay women less than they would pay a man, thus saving the publication money. Very true. Yes.
So a commercial strategy in a variety of ways. Yes, 100%. So one is that it was for many, they saw it as a way to sell the newspapers, that having bylines by women was seen as marketable. So as a way to sell newspapers. Also, in general, the pattern was that women were much more likely to work as freelance journalists than as salaried staff members, which meant that they could be paid less than writers who were given regular salaries. So yes, so commercial in both of those senses as a sort of strategy there. Yes.
I love staged arguments between pen names. It's like wrestling. Are there any trends and or interesting divergences in the ways these men writing as women wrote about men in their columns?
Sure. So I didn't have time to include this in my talk, but my favorite example, and I talk about this in my book for a while, is that there's a period, I think it's between like 1908 and 1910, where Getzel Zelikovic creates a second persona called Merely a Man. And they have weekly columns where they argue, where the two personas, the Lithuanian wise woman and Merely a Man, argue back and forth about men and women. And are men better at giving advice than women? Are men better at receiving advice than women? And like they're going through all of these stereotypes and tropes. And in some ways, this is supposed to be giving people advice about how to live their lives, but it's also clearly supposed to be entertaining content. And so you're supposed to be reading it in both of those ways, which I think is really fascinating.
Thanks. I'm wondering if there was any correlation. Was there any correlation? It's funny the way this is done. Is there any correlation you found between the emergence of girl stunt reporters, i.e. Nellie Bly, Ida B. Wells, and women doing similar investigative work in the Yiddish press?
So there is some investigative work by women. The appearance of investigative journalism by women in the American popular press is an impetus for the American Yiddish press to include more female bylines. But there aren't as many women doing investigative work in the same way. The only really good example, and Saul Zaret, who's one of my colleagues, has just written an article about her, is Sarah B. Smith, who is known for her sort of pulpy fiction, but was also a court reporter for the day. She did divorce trials as well as criminal trials. And so that was sort of in the vein of sob sister, quote unquote, journalism in the American popular press. It's very clearly drawing on that sort of lineage.
We have audio and translation of some of Sarah Smith's courtroom work. It's just fabulous. Okay, a question is, Mr. Zelikovic, aka the Lithuanian wise woman, was this masquerading as a woman really a secret to the newspaper community and readers, or was his true identity known? And to what extent was he simply having fun, a prankster, or making serious points with the impersonation?
This is, yes, all of the above, basically, is the answer to that question. So the reading experience of people who would read the column alone versus the reading experience of people who read the column in tandem with his other writing is very different. So Getzel Zelikovic, in his non-women's columns, talks about the fact that he's the Lithuanian wise woman. And he talks about why he is writing as the Lithuanian wise woman. So if you're reading these things in tandem, you know. But he also creates this entire backstory for this woman. He talks about her children. He talks about her husband. He talks about her immigration story in ways that are very, like, sometimes it is tongue-in-cheek, but often it is trying to convey actual messages that the paper is talking about in other sections of the paper, but to women. So there's a really complicated mix between entertaining tongue-in-cheek content and actual ideological messages that the newspaper really wants to convey to its readers.
Do any of the women challenge or question the limited roles women were allowed to play in Orthodox Judaism?
So the roles that women are allowed to play in Orthodox Judaism, yeah, to a certain extent they do. Also, many of them also talk about the roles that women are allowed to play within Orthodox Judaism as being roles of power. So there's both of those within the Orthodox press, and then within the socialist press, there are critiques of religion as well as critiques of socialism and the roles that women play in both of those sort of spheres within Jewish culture.
How common was female literacy, and where were girls taught to read Yiddish? Was that an American phenomenon, or was it also going on in Europe?
So a little bit of both. And I think here it's sort of helpful to break up the period of mass migration into sort of smaller periodlets, because the literacy rates are going to be very different for different groups. So if someone has migrated to the United States before about 1900, the likeliest scenario is that they are not very literate, whether they're a man or whether they're a woman. If you come after about 1905 or so, it is much likelier that you have a higher level of literacy. There are various reasons for that I don't think we have time to get into today, but that's basically the case. And also because there are newspapers, daily newspapers in Eastern Europe beginning in 1903, you're much more likely to be trained to be a newspaper reader if you come over after about 1905 or so. So these newspapers include material that's meant to be for people with various literacy levels. And especially in this early period, there's a lot of teaching people how to read Yiddish within the newspaper. There's very easy, large type, things like that, lots of pictures related to the type. And there's also a lot of content that's teaching them how to be newspaper readers specifically. So in some of Zelikovich's columns, for example, he's teaching people like you're supposed to look at this kind of column for this kind of material and this kind of column for this kind of material. So it's a process of training. But there's also a lot of sort of circumstantial or testimonial evidence of people learning to read through these newspapers or being encouraged to read through these newspapers. So if you look at memoirs or oral histories and things like that, you'll often see, especially for women, that these columns are being read aloud to them, and that eventually encourages them to begin reading on their own.
Why was the Ladies' Corner published under these English words written in Yiddish? Was the Yiddish changing, incorporating more English? Was there such a language trend in Yiddish papers elsewhere?
Yes. So the Yiddish in newspapers in general, so this is before the standardization of Yiddish, well before the standardization of Yiddish as a language. So the language is very unformed in terms of standards within newspapers, which is very hard for things like transliteration. Within a single article, the same word will be written in different spellings, like 4 different spellings within the same article by the same author. It's very frustrating. But within this particular time, there's a lot of material being translated directly from English because they do not have enough staff writers to write all of the content originally. And some of it, they don't know exactly how to translate, so they'll just include it in Yiddish, and some people may have understood it, some people may have not. But there's also a sense of incorporating English into Yiddish because it mimics the way that people actually speak in their daily lives, and these newspapers are trying to sort of be enticing to readers who that's how they live their lives as well.
What is known about the, quote, private life of Zelikovic? Example, marriage, family?
So he did marry, but after he began writing under a female pseudonym. And another interesting sort of mysterious part of his private life is that the reasons that are given, there are a couple, why he was let go from the University of Pennsylvania. The 2 that I've found from different sources are, 1, various intrigues by the Jesuits, no idea what that means, and that he was having relationships with students, male and female. And so we don't know exactly what that means. We don't know how accurate that is, but gives us some interesting information.
Any evidence of how the male writers felt about their female personas? Did they have to work at sounding, quote, female? Did they female, I think they mean feel comfortable or uncomfortable about their masquerade?
So it depends on the author, and it depends on how they're talking about it. Zelikovic is a good example of this because he switches back and forth depending on what point he wants to make. So he wrote a variety of different content throughout his life. He was an editor of this newspaper as well. And he also wrote a lot of their pulpy popular fiction. And so some of that he wrote under female pseudonyms. And he talked about it sometimes as a thing he was doing for financial reasons, and he was very ashamed of it. That's why he's writing under pseudonyms, because he wants to separate it. And sometimes he talked about it as like a valuable cultural endeavor. And so all of these men, when we have sort of things in their voice that are explaining their decision-making and how they felt about these female pseudonyms, are pretty unreliable narrators, because usually when they talk about these decisions, they're trying to make certain ideological points while talking about them.
I'd like to ask for clarification on a point you mentioned. I think that Yiddish newspapers appeared in the US before they appeared in Europe. Were there any countries in Europe, for example, Poland, where Yiddish newspapers appeared in the 19th century?
So there were small Yiddish journals and publications in Eastern Europe, a variety of places in Eastern Europe in the 19th century. What I was saying is that daily newspapers, Yiddish daily newspapers, were in the United States before they were in Eastern Europe. So the first Yiddish daily in Eastern Europe was published, I believe it was 1903. And the first Yiddish daily in the United States that lasted more than like 3 or 4 issues was in 1885. So about 20 years before.
How does the Jewish experience that you've described compare with that of other immigrant ethnic groups?
Yeah, so there are some important overlaps. The idea of using American mainstream English language journalism as a model is there in a lot of different newspapers. One big difference is that many of these other newspaper traditions, whether it's Italian or German or whatever, have a longer history in whatever country these immigrants are coming from of journalism that they can sort of also incorporate as well. And many of them are also importing a lot of the content from newspapers in Germany or from Italy or things like that. So that's a big difference. And also the fact that compared with, for example, Italian immigration, which is the other sort of very large immigration group at the same time, Jewish immigrants tended to come over in about equal numbers in terms of gender, especially right away. That was less true of other immigrant groups, where the gender breakdown was a little bit less even, especially at the beginning. So that means that the Yiddish press had more female readers to draw on when they were trying to create this female-centric approach and draw on American popular culture.
I guess somewhat of a follow-up question. So did the Yiddish newspapers in Europe not reach the heights of popularity or quality of the ones in the US?
They eventually became very popular and very successful and very literarily rich, but it took longer, is really the answer. So only beginning in 1903 do you have daily newspapers, and it's they really rise to this level of mass popularity after that, but really in the interwar period between World War I and World War II.
You're keeping up like in a really intense tennis match here, lobbing over. Are you okay?
Sorry, and am I speaking too fast? I've been
No, it's great. I just feel like I'm, peppering these out. You've got a lot of questions here. I recall seeing lists of personnel in TOG marking their anniversary, which included Lebensboim, I hope I got that right, under 2 of her pseudonyms. Comment?
Yes. It's this interesting thing because in some cases they really wanted to make it look as if there were more people on the staff in general and more women especially than there were. So she had several different female pseudonyms that she wrote under in the TUG, especially when she was the editor of the women's page, because then it looked like it was a more robust staff. I've also found at least one payroll of the TUG that lists Ida Brenner, the female pseudonym of BZ Goldberg, as the person receiving a salary and not BZ Goldberg. And that is at least some evidence that they at least want to make it seem, and I don't know why they would want to make it seem behind the scenes other than not actually knowing that this is the actual author and not BZ Goldberg.
When these men wrote under female pseudonym, did they go on to establish themselves as male writers later in career? Was this an early start?
Yes. So they generally, this was like an early transitional phase for many of these men, especially those who wrote in like the 1918 to 1920 period. So that's also true of poets. So Jacob Gladstein Janke Blattstein. He wrote under a female pseudonym at the beginning of his career. Moshe Nadir also wrote under a female pseudonym, and they all talk about it as this transitional phase. It's like a way to get a foothold, and then you can do your real quote unquote work. Obviously, that's not how I feel about this work, when you are writing as a man afterwards.
Wondering if Eastern European Pale newspapers and or literature and book publications were sent to the US and vice versa. Did these two populations read one another's writing? It seems that in Pale, many people read Yiddish books and journals.
Yes, there was a big smuggling market when the Russian Empire was still what was ruling in that area. There was a big smuggling market of things from Eastern Europe being smuggled out to America, but even more so things from America being smuggled into Eastern Europe. So these newspapers that I'm talking about, even before there was a Yiddish daily press in Eastern Europe, these newspapers were being smuggled into the Russian Empire.
And I'm going to just take a little bit from this, it's a long question, but as a follow-up question, which Yiddish newspapers were most commonly read, if you know, in Los Angeles at the end of the 19th century?
Los Angeles at the end of the 19th century. So all of these newspapers had very strong local in New York settings, but they also all had envoys who like traveled the world to try to drum up subscriptions everywhere, and they sent their newspapers everywhere. In the, sorry, what were the dates again? Late 19th century?
Yeah.
So the most popular newspaper before about 1905 or so would have been the Orthodox newspaper, the Tageblatt, the Jewish Daily News. So like that is a big possibility. The Forward is beginning to rise then, but is only really becoming sort of the major player in the field that we think of it as, only beginning after 1903, 1905 or so. So it sort of depends somewhat on political outlook of the person who's reading, but also on sort of exactly the moment that we're talking about.
And I'm going to end with this question, if you can answer it. What's the status of women in journalism today in the Jewish press, editors, publishers, etc.?
Well, this is a fun thing that I end my book on, is that the only newspaper that I study in this book that still exists in some form today is the Forward, and it exists online. And the Yiddish version of the Forward, the editor is a woman, and this is the first time that that is true, and that says something really interesting about the ways in which this newspaper has transformed over time.
Ayelet, thank you so much for a phenomenal program. We'll have to get you back on again and get you back to the center to talk more. Again, for all of you out there, A Revolution in Type, Gender and the Making of the American Yiddish Press. Get it now, read it. It's available at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org and wherever you find really good books. Thanks, and see you soon. I'd like to thank this evening's producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli, for all her help making it all possible behind the scenes. Tonight's program is part of our ongoing series of virtual and live public programs. I hope you'll join us Sunday, March 3rd at 2 p.m. when we present a conversation about Isaac Bashevis Singer's writings on Yiddish and Yiddishkeit, the war years 1939 to 1945, with the author's editor and translator, David Stromberg. This program is presented as part of Great Jewish Books, and a discussion will follow after that. You can register for that program and check out all of our listings in our calendar of events at yiddishbookcenter.org/events. I want to take a moment to thank all of our members out there who make all of our ongoing work possible. Learn more about how you can support all of our programming at yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. Thanks as always for joining us. Stay well, stay safe, stay happy, and we'll see you again really soon. Thanks.